Welcome to another session of the council. That's what we call the show here. In attendance with me is a man who I think we can easily, comfortably say is one of the people responsible for Nation of Sport being here today. Rohan Vyavaharkar. He has been a sports correspondent at NDTV. You've headed communications for Red Bull and Twitter India. You ran your own sports consultancy called Argonium. Argonium. I got the name right, not bad. Pronunciation right, I'm sorry. You ran Stepathlon Sports as well. And currently you are director in marketing and communications at a fairly large investment firm that's looking to make its mark in India. So welcome to the show, Rohan.
Thank you very much.
As I gave you a heads up, the show is about discussing issues and the Indian sports industry in general, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to start off with the question that I ask all our guests, which is, do you think India is a nation of sport?
I think there's two answers to that, right?
Sure.
I think there's the present and there's the future.
Okay.
At the present, no. I think short answer to that is no.
Okay. You're going to ruffle a few feathers there.
Yeah, I think we're not. We're not. I mean, and as someone who played sport at a fairly competitive level, and for someone who lives and breathes sport, I think we're not a nation of sport.
Okay.
Right? We're a nation of sports watchers.
Right.
We're not a nation of sport. Big difference.
Okay.
Right? There's a country a few seas away from here with a population of about the city that we're sitting in,
Right.
and that produces gold medals for fun, right?
Okay.
And we struggle, and we have one Abhinav Bindra, and we still celebrate. I mean, as we should. There's no question. I mean, he's an athlete par excellence. But 8 years later, after his achievement, or 10 years later now, after his achievement, we're still celebrating him because he's the only person who's done that.
Right.
Still,
exactly.
Right? So I think that there's a big. So we're not a nation of sport. Can we be a nation of sport? I think that we're changing. Right. I think there's been far more democratization of facilities, of sort of this thought process and I think Abhinav Bindra in principle is responsible for a lot of that change in thought process.
Yes.
Right. Abhinav Bindra and the cohort of sort of successful Olympians with him in 2008. We're changing. We will change over a period of time, but I think that eventually we don't. Eventually, if we don't sort of migrate from talking about sport to actually playing it, we will never become a nation of sport. But
Sure.
I think that the Sainas of the world, the sort of boxers, all the boxers
Right.
that we have.
Akhil, Vijender,
I mean,
Mary Kom, a
that
whole
whole
bunch of these.
gang,
Yeah.
and I think that in general we can try and change. We can be a nation of sport. I don't think we're one yet.
Okay. So I'll ask one more question to that before we move to the topic of the conversation. It's like, what do you think are the two things that we need to do immediately towards becoming a nation of sport?
I think one is that we need to get every child to play. Right?
Okay.
I take my daughters to a park not too far from here, and there's a sign over there that says "Keep off the grass." Right? What are they going to do? Trample it to death? Right? Really? So the point is, we don't have enough space to play. Right? We live in Bombay, yes, and there are places across the country, like Delhi, for example, where there are facilities that are slightly better,
Right.
and with a lot more access. But I think in general, we don't provide the raw material required to help create that sporting culture.
Right.
And I think that's the point. And City Fort in Delhi, for example, is a fantastic case in point of when done right, it's a public place, it's for public use. It's always packed. It's always packed.
And increasingly so.
And
you have
increasingly
people,
so,
yeah,
right? And
yeah.
it's amazing. I mean, it's good to watch because these are all people brought together for different interests, varying age groups, varying socioeconomic classes, and everybody sort of comes together at one particular place. And it's fantastic to watch. But on the other hand, you have a system where we've hosted an under-17 World Cup,
Right.
we've hosted a Commonwealth Games, and what's happening now to those facilities because we don't provide access,
Right.
is that they're crumbling, right? Because you don't provide access, right? So nobody turns up, or you make access so difficult that nobody turns up. Nobody turns up, it doesn't get used, it falls into disrepair, and you're like, okay, listen, it's falling into disrepair, therefore no one's using it, and because no one's using it, it's falling into further disrepair. It's this
Right.
vicious cycle.
Right, absolutely.
And no one's going to take charge of that, and then eventually what happens is you don't have any place for people to actually go and play, right? You don't have, an Olympic track is the best motivation a 7-year-old runner can have, right? Like imagine telling a little girl saying, "Hey, you're running on the same track that PT Usha once ran on."
Got it.
And imagine the motivation that she gets just out of that simple fact, or or telling a boy saying, "Listen, this is the hockey field, and in which Bhargat used to train."
Right.
And that boy's like, "Okay, wow, I'm going to do this," right?
Right.
As opposed to saying that no, you can't enter that because you know what, you're a 7-year-old kid, you're a wit, like. go
Yeah,
away
you,
from
you,
it.
you don't you don't play and you're not
You
part of
don't,
the
you don't
national team.
you don't matter. You don't.
Yeah.
So while I think that there is incredible importance that places like the NIS have in the setup, but I also think that it's increasingly important that we create facilities that people have access to, and we do have those facilities. The sad part is the facilities exist.
Right.
Sorry, I'm taking over the
Sure, no, absolutely. No, please
podcast
go.
here,
Yeah.
but I think the facilities exist.
Right.
They do exist. It's just a question of unlocking those facilities for people who ought to be there. And the point is, everyone ought to be there.
Sure. And that's why I like the example you gave with City Fort, because City Fort for a very long time was the same situation that you mentioned,
Correct,
which
yeah.
is it was lying there unused. I remember because I happened to do a squash event there, and the squash courts were absolutely in abysmal shape. But once we brought that squash tournament there, the City Fort realized, oh, there is benefit in doing this. So that's when they kind of cleaned up the entire place.
So this is what's happening. You're taking credit for Sports Revival.
I am not at all. I think the credit goes to PSA because they were the ones.
Right.
PSA
Correct.
brought the World Squash Masters, and you got to credit them for being patient with that entire complex and saying, hey, let's bring this together,
Yeah.
and it kind of helped them revive that
Yeah.
place. And what strikes me about City Fort more than anything else is not the facility, but how organized the games are there in terms of, okay, this is your games from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock, my games from 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. There's no overlap that happens. So for me, that's a bigger win in
Yeah,
terms of just getting it organized.
And like again, and this is very very Bandra specific example, but you have the St. Andrews AstroTurf,
Right.
right?
Right.
And again, look at that. I mean, it's always full. Right?
Yeah.
And it's great for the community because now the community has a place to. I mean, yes, it's only football and cricket, but at the same time, at least it's football and cricket.
It's something.
It's something. Now, I would love to see more kids do it. Right now, it's all uncles like us who get there. But I would love to see more kids to take up
Right.
sport there, and not the not this football school or not that club's football school sort of trying to make a fast buck, but actual genuine kids who are out there, trying to learn a new sport, trying to learn some new skills, and don't forget that sport by itself, as you and I both know, has such an incredible long-term impact on life
Absolutely.
skills.
Absolutely. That
Right?
is a.
So I mean, we're talking about Australia a little while earlier. You look at Australia and the kind of the mentality and the kind of athletes that we see come out.
Sure.
Come out of there. The exception perhaps of Nick Kyrgios, but I think you see those you see a lot of those guys come out and they're just tough as nails when they make it into the big league.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a lot of that has got to do with how much time you invest in sport as a personality.
Sure.
And community.
And also the thing about how they're just not about one sport. Like a lot of them play multiple sports as well. Like it's part of the culture, which is something that I guess that would probably be one of the points for me. Like personally, if you had asked me what is it that I'd like to do, or what's the first thing that needs to change, is that culture needs to come through, and it ties into your point, which is that culture will start coming to if kids start going more to grounds, and then parents automatically get involved, and the entire
Correct.
ecosystem
Absolutely, yeah.
comes
Yeah,
together.
absolutely.
How has the relationship of sport and media evolved in India over the years? So I'll start that conversation off by asking you a question: is, in your opinion, what are the maybe 2 or 3 tipping points that helped sport evolve this relationship with media in India?
I think, unfortunately, we have to look at this per sport, right? Because I think the one thing we must recognize is that for whatever you might feel about the BCCI, the job that the BCCI has done to help develop its sport, cricket in India, is phenomenal, right? I mean, you look at the Jagmohan Dalmi and I.S. Bindra sort of duo that did what it did in the 1980s.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? Or you look at what, for that matter, even like the dominance that the BCCI now has in the global sort of scenario. Um, and yes, it has its upside and its downside. But I think cricket by itself has its own trajectory, and then there's everything else.
Everything, right.
Arguably, hockey should have been that. Right?
Okay.
Given our legacy in hockey, right? I mean, because we should have been sitting here talking about, talking about the gold medals that we've had.
We should have, yes.
And talked about that as an inflection point and how hockey's sort of gone off on its own, created its own legacy now.
Right.
Unfortunately, I don't know how many people here would even know that Odisha is hosting a World Cup. So I think that's a testament to how much hockey star has just sort of fallen, right? I think so that's one.
Sure.
But I think that in terms of just specific inflection points, I think with no sort of order, and I'm just trying to bring as many of these sort of things together. I think the one we were talking about earlier, Abhinav Bindra's gold medal, I think is an inflection point for sure.
Okay.
Because to me, what that gave us was an opportunity. So actually, the 2008 Olympics.
Okay.
Right. So Saina, Abhinav, the boxers. I think that really gave us the opportunity to talk about something that wasn't cricket, right? In a real meaningful sense.
Right.
I think so that's one, right? I think and it's going to be a longer list than 2 or 3.
Sure.
But I think the other is also what Leander and Mahesh did. Right?
Oh, interesting.
In the mid 1990s again, because suddenly how many people before them had won a Grand Slam?
Right.
Answer zero. But I'm just saying that you have the first Indians to win a Grand Slam, the first Indian doubles Grand Slam winners, right? So I think that again makes that made all the difference.
And global recognition for those guys.
And global recognition, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have people like you. I mean, I've been on the road with these guys, right? And I think you see the respect that a lot of these, the respect that they had during their playing days, is still very much valid today. So I think there is. So that's another sort of important inflection point for me. I think the 1983 World Cup changes everything.
Sure.
And I think that's true just about of any sort of any sort of conversation, including cultural. The 1983 World Cup helped change a lot of those sort of conversation metrics. And the reason I think the 1983 World Cup for me trumps a lot is because it suddenly gave the cricketers, and I'm not saying this in a good way necessarily, our current coach of the Indian cricket team included, and I think gave the cricketers the confidence to talk about things or to present themselves in a way, not talk about, but present themselves in a way that was unheard of to the generation gone by, and a lot of the pre 83 cricketers, right, openly or not so openly, talk very grudgingly about the 83 crew.
So I've heard.
Right?
Yes, so I've heard.
And similarly, the 83 crew will talk about, in almost similar sort of not so glowing terms about the post liberalization or the post sort of Dalmia or the post sort of the post Mark Mascarenhas era of Indian sport, of Indian cricket, right?
Yes.
So I think so I think that those sort of things, and therefore I think the 1996 World Cup becomes that inflection point. Mark Mascarenhas coming up and pulling picking up Sachin Tendulkar on the field. That again becomes, to me, is an inflection point in Indian sport, because that really changed it, bringing in this management of athletes, right? Bringing in the big bucks of the sort of Rod Tidwell moment of of Indian sport, and I think that automatically changed a lot of things for the way the media looked at the sport, because they were like, up until that point it was always about the numbers and the runs, whatever. But now we were talking about the endorsement deals, and we were talking about, like, I used to love covering the business of sport, but without Mark Mascarenhas, there is no business of sport.
There is no, yes, absolutely.
So I think those are sort of the things that in a few inflection points that come to mind easily, and I think automatically, and maybe it's a little early, But I think what's happening right now, the inflection point of, and maybe I'm just being premature, and maybe it's all a part of a larger campaign. I doubt it though. But like Gautam Gambhir going, gung-ho on this nationalistic temper, and Virat Kohli having said what he's just said a few days
Right.
ago, and I don't mean to date this, so we can edit
Right,
this out,
right.
but having said what he said, but this nationalistic fervor that's coming into sports narrative,
Okay.
right? That's also about to change the way you look at sport, because it's easy, right? Like as an athlete, if as a journalist I criticize you for a lack of a performance, you'll be like, you don't like me, get out of the country.
Right.
It's
right.
very Trumpian, right? In
Right.
its implication. And,
As a
and that's
matter
the
of fact,
problem.
that I mean, very similar to what happened with Harsha and Dhoni and Amitabh Bachchan, a couple of years ago, where Amitabh Bachchan tweeted what Amitabh Bachchan tweets, and suddenly there's this whole and Harsha's off the grid for a few months. So fair enough. And one thing that for me particularly, all the inflection points you mentioned, I think one of the inflection points for me was interesting. It kind of segues into kind of takes us into the next conversation, which is what Star Sports did with Kabaddi, which was a rural sport, goes from there to this incredibly well produced show. And Star didn't even say, okay, let's try this out and see how it works. They brought in the guns for the first season itself, and that's why it's grown to where it is. So, what's your opinion? What are your thoughts on Star's dominance currently over the sports? I would say sports broadcasting in India right now.
Look, I mean, monopoly isn't always a good thing.
Okay.
Right? But over here, to be fair, I think the other broadcasters, and now there's only one other,
right?
They've had their shot. What do they do with it? No much.
Right.
And again, I'm sure there's different reasons, and I'm no one to call judgment on anyone. But I think the bigger thing is that, would you rather that they don't exist? That's the flip side, right? Like, would you rather that Kabaddi did not exist?
Right.
Dominance, yes, we can argue that dominance is not, is not productive for anybody. It isn't, but the opposite here is essentially the onus then is on Sony and 10.
Right.
What do they do with the I League?
Yeah.
Right. What did they do? They had that World Cup of Kabaddi or whatever, some World Kabaddi League.
World Kabaddi League.
And what do they do with that? Right. What do they do with the boxing that they start? There's a very long list.
Sure.
Right. So it's not like they haven't tried. It's just that they haven't been able to do a good enough job of it. And I think the reason that is that it's very hard in the land of Bollywood, right, or in the land of sort of Virat Kohli and Sachin Tendulkar. It's very hard to capture the imagination of people, right?
Sure.
Of the Indian thing, and we're very easily distracted,
right?
And I think Star recognized that,
right?
So when you combine entertainment or an entertainment-like attribute of sport, IPL,
right?
I mean, we could go back to Lalit Modi, and so I think, and obviously IPL, to your earlier point about inflection point, obviously IPL is an inflection point, but I think IPL is an inflection point in the larger thing. The media had already sort of started to, by that point, the cricketer was already out of reach in that.
Sure, and I think anything that cricket's done per se is largely a byproduct of, like you said, the '83 World Cup, and then of course Dalmia and IS Bindra doing what they
correct.
did.
I mean, I don't see a Lalit Modi without Dalmia, so
precisely.
Let's get that out of the way. But I think to come back to your point, in order to capture the imagination of the average Indian, I think it's very important that you have to match the Hindi or the vernacular equivalent of the Saas Bahu show.
Right.
You have to match that drama.
Right.
IPL did that. Pro Kabaddi did it.
Right.
It is about that drama. It is about, which is why these ridiculous shows like Big Brother or whatever it's called in India, like they do well because they are matching the drama that's missing in their lives.
Right.
Right.
And interesting you mentioned that, because that's what Star Sports did with doing multiple languages this year.
Absolutely.
And you hear the commentators there; they are all super dramatic. These guys are trained people who not really been sports commentators, but they've been trained to do it. Super dramatic. So I see where you.
So and I think unless you provide that drama, look, I love to say that, sport is real life drama.
It is.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing more dramatic than live sport for me, at least.
Sure.
Right? I mean, especially if you look at what happened with Manchester United taking on Juventus in Turin, right? Been outplayed for a large part of the game, and suddenly, hey, 2 goals in and you're winning, right? That doesn't happen. I don't want to go to Camp Nou and talk about 1999, but I just, but you get the picture, right? Like,
Yes.
I think there is a real, there is a real sort of, there's a real emotion to sport which you cannot replicate with any script, right? So
Absolutely.
Match fixing notwithstanding, but yeah.
So I want to pick on something you said in the middle there, where you kind of mentioned in the land of Bollywood / and then you mentioned Virat Kohli and Sachin Tendulkar. You know, my guess is what you were trying to get there was how, as an audience in general in this country, tends to draw itself towards personalities as opposed to sport.
Yeah.
So, do you think the way we broadcast sport is a reflection of that? That we're drawn towards the athlete and personalities as opposed to the sport or the story or the production or the action on the field?
Yes and no. I think inherently stories are driven by characters.
Okay.
Right? So any story, right? Like you wouldn't find a TV show half as interesting if the hero was a dud, or
Sure.
or the lead actress was boring.
Sure.
Right? But I think what I find tedious and almost sort of boring, and clearly I'm in the minority, but what I do find is the emphasis on the persona rather than on the athlete. And what I mean by that is this separation, saying that, and let's take Virat Kohli, right? I mean, his latest rant notwithstanding, I think he's been a flawless cricketer. But this obsession with Virat Kohli and Anushka and his marriage and all of that. I mean, sure, there will be some of this will play out in public, and he's an attractive guy, she's an attractive girl, and
She's Bollywood also.
She's Bollywood. I mean,
Yeah.
there's bound to be some sort of overlap there. But I think in general, this whole obsession that we have with telling these stories of these guys, right? I find that very tedious, right? And I think the focus on the prowess of an athlete in the sport has been taken away by all the peripherals.
Right.
So we started to focus
Okay.
on the peripherals, right? One of the reasons I got a little disillusioned with sports journalism is primarily because the peripherals became more attractive than the essentials.
Okay.
So
So could I ask you to clarify that? Did it become more attractive, or was the focus started to move that direction, or are they the same
I
thing?
mean, it is one and the same, right?
Okay.
Because so it's like this. I mean, at a social sort of commentary level, if I show you a shiny object, right? It's like everything that glitters is not gold, right? So if I start to show you, it's this typical thing with shiny objects and little children, right? Like you can show them something that they could play with, and you can give them a box and you can give them a shiny object. They will engage with the shiny object for a little bit,
Right.
But they will probably find the box more useful to play with,
Right.
because they have an imagination and everything.
Sure.
The problem is, with the way we are today, is that once I'm bored with this shiny object, instead of saying, hey, let's just return back to the basics, what's happening is, especially in the media, in the news media, I'm trying to show you as many new shiny objects as possible. That translates into sensationalism.
I see. Okay.
Right? So, oh, you're bored with this? Oh, let me talk to you about this. Let me talk to you about that. I mean, it's not just sports journalism. It happens in the political realm. It happens in pretty much every other. Right? So, which is what I'm saying. I don't want to get into the social commentary of it, but I think that it's sort of all pervasive. That this sort of storytelling has become overly dramatic, and because it's becoming overly dramatic, you have to find drama outside the core sporting sort of arena.
Right.
And when that starts to happen, it's no longer sports journalism.
Sure.
And which is where then the persona becomes more important. And then because the persona becomes more important, then you start to feed this, this sort of growing fire where, people want more information. So you dig deeper. As you dig deeper, because by the mere act of observation you're changing something.
Yeah, and
and then so on and so
self-feeding,
forth. So,
self-feeding frenzy.
correct.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Self-feeding frenzy, and then automatically, then the athletes are reacting to that sort of thing, because then there is hypocritical sort of analysis of everything they do. Oh, he wore a red shirt, and it was such a, and the
It's a
communists.
somber occasion.
Yeah, it was exactly somber occasion. So he's wearing a red shirt. How could he? And that fellow will say something that becomes a part of the news cycle, and then it just sort of goes on from there, right? And I think that's really where I get lost.
Right.
That's something that I couldn't care about, and I think, like I said, I'm in the minority, but I think that needs very quick correction.
Right. I want to go back to something you said, and obviously your relationship with sports correspondence, sports news in India. In the US, you have a very popular show called Sports Center, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is like become a daily. It's part of people's daily routine now. It's like, hey, let's catch Sports Center. Knowing what you know in terms of how Indians consume sport and how sport's been broadcast in India, why do you think, in your opinion, why don't we have a Sports Center?
Well, I mean, I used to do a Sports Center equivalent, right?
Okay, so let me rephrase. Why don't we have a Sports Center anymore? Why didn't a program like the one that you hosted continue? And we have so many channels. We have 18 channels now. Why does not a single one of them does a Sports Center?
I think I think that because one or two things, right? I think unless that Sports Center can give me the stuff the gossipy stuff about athletes. Okay. I mean, there's a reason why, let me answer that with another sort of statement, right? There's a reason why almost every news channel that used to have a sports show, including the one I used to work for, doesn't have a sports show
anymore,
right? 7:30 was a given. We would compete with 6. I remember at one point in time, NDTV was competing with 6 different sports shows, right?
Right. Everyone had a sports show.
Everyone had a sports show at 7:30. Some of them then switched to 8. Some moved to 7. We responded, and I mean, basically there was always a sports show, and it was a coveted sports show.
Right.
The reason it doesn't exist today is because I think one is because I don't think there is an appetite for sports news the way it's envisioned. Right. Yes, we are obsessed with numbers as a country, but I think the skill to tell those stories, I mean, let's look at the journalists first, right? I think somewhere we have failed in our effort to contextualize it for the audience, right? Because you have to change with the times, right? Like, you have to try and figure out, hey, what do you find interesting? Not what I'm a sports fan. I will be able to give you the. I'll tell you who won the Dilip Trophy in 2004. The average sports fan can't, right? And I think that gives you the opportunity to actually reinvent yourself, and we fail to reinvent ourselves. I think that's a large part of the problem. The other thing is that Sports Center works fabulously for an American audience, because it evolves from the regular radio sports broadcast. There used to be a tradition of radio sports broadcasts in every American town, right? So where you had the US, especially like Friday nights, right? So Friday night there'd be, I think, a 10 o'clock or a 10:30 broadcast. I can't remember which, but it would capture the local scene. What happened in the local football games, what happened in the local basketball games, what happened in the local hockey games, ice hockey games, and that was an institution.
Yes.
Right? And the sports talk radio in America is an institution, which we don't have that culture here. I think what we tried to do is just sort of ape it, which is, again, not surprising. We try and ape a lot from the West, and we tried to ape it without actually being able to contextualize it in a way. So it worked for a while because of its novelty, and it worked well for a while, and for a long time.
Yes.
But I think eventually you don't keep pace with what's happening, because the same audience that was consuming our content was also slowly starting to get drawn to the web, where they were getting snappy stuff customized in the way that they wanted. Stories told about things in depth, about what they cared about, right? Like, you go back and sort of look at what we were doing. We were not doing basketball.
Correct.
right? I mean, we'd capture the odd. Like I went to Phoenix to cover an All Stars
The All-Star
game,
game, yes.
and I'm not proud to admit, but I genuinely thought Kevin Durant was. I can't even remember, but like I did not recognize Kevin Durant. I thought he was someone else,
Right.
right? And no, actually, I asked Kevin Durant what it was like to move from the Raptors to the Celtics when he had actually moved from the Timberwolves, and
Okay.
and I know that now,
Right.
but.
Kevin Garnett, you mean?
Kevin Garnett, sorry.
Kevin
Garnett, sorry.
Right.
See, that's what I'm saying, right?
Exactly.
Like, and it's terrible, right?
I
And I was on one of the largest sports broadcasting shows, and I think
Right.
that to me is sort of it's my own. It is my own shortcoming, but it sort of also underlines how a lot of us who and don't get me wrong, I will still categorize myself as a very hardcore sports fan,
Right.
right? But I made mistakes, and I was not, I didn't keep in sort of in sync with what a lot of people required, and I think that was a larger sort of malaise across sort of thing. And I think as the internet's come in, and as people have been drawn to various other sources for their news, etc., it's automatically changing.
So, a related question: why couldn't India's Sports Star magazine become, for instance, the Sports Illustrated? Of course, notwithstanding the fact that Sports Illustrated is struggling now in the US. As a matter of fact, they're reducing the number of
Runs,
the number of publications per year, but or number of issues per year.
Yeah.
Why hasn't Sports Star become right now? If you talk to somebody about Sports Star, like people like you and me remember, we have this almost nostalgic feeling about
Sure.
the days I used to read Sports Star.
Sports Star.
Why isn't that thing Why isn't that thing changing now? Because this is now moving towards the written side of media, right? Why hasn't Sports Star been able to stay relevant?
Why is that? I mean, another way of asking it is why is sportstar.in not the ESPN Go, right? Like,
Got it.
and I think what was the evolution that why could ESPN? I mean, why could Sportstar not evolve to be that digital sort of thing? And I think somewhere Sportstar failed to evolve, right? And I think that's true for a lot of. I mean, again, I think it's easy to single out Sportstar because they were the only people who were doing a good job of it,
Right.
right? But I think there's a host of sort of publications.
There were a
that
bunch. There was all sports had come.
yeah, no,
they
and
started
I'm just
stopped
saying that I mean, there's the history is littered with all these media companies that failed,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
And I think Sportstar is one of them, and I think they could have been far more sort of. And again, I don't know. I can't put my finger on
Sure.
it, but I think that I don't know. Maybe it's not too late, because
Same here, I agree.
as it happens, and there is IRS numbers to prove this, Indian Readership Survey numbers to prove this, that we're the only country in the world where magazine readership continues to grow year on year.
Oh, interesting.
Right? So
Right.
there's clearly a market, right? Now, I'm pretty certain that readership continues to grow for stuff involving film and and fashion
Entertainment.
and entertainment and
Right.
all the stuff that you could argue is not society changing stuff. But I think someone's going to call me out on that. But I just think that but I just like things that we people like you and I may not think of as something that's essential reading.
Right.
Right. But on the other hand, if that is the case, then maybe there is some virtue
Right.
for for people to pay attention and see that maybe there's an opportunity
Sure.
for sports data. I mean, I hope it does. I'd pay a couple of $100 to to pick up a sports star.
Absolutely, and I still think they do a good job. It's just that sometimes I wonder why is it that they didn't become bigger than they currently are. That's
Yeah,
all.
absolutely.
So in that case, I think I'll use that to kind of wrap this conversation up. It's like you have considerable experience both across communications and obviously the sports media. You're somebody who's well aware of what's happening globally in terms of how sports in society, sports and media's relationships grows. If you had the power to change or bring in two things into sports media in India, what would those two things you would do? And take your time with the question.
That's I think the one is we need tell. I think one is, if I had the power, like let's just train a new breed of journalists who want to who want to who want to cover sport for the sake of the sport,
Got it.
right? And I'll tell you why that's important. As I started to exit sports journalism, right? Now I'm somebody, like I said, I've played cricket competitively, right? I understand the difference between weight transfer, like why the importance of weight transfer, the importance of where your head ought to be, where your hands ought to be when you strike the ball with your bat. Even like when you're bowling, the difference between having an arm straight and the arm sort of, the elbow coming from behind. And I know the importance of these things, right?
Right.
I was fortunate, right? I covered the game with people like Rajan Bala, for example, and it's a good way to, like, great story is basically we were covering a test match in Bangalore and sitting with Rajan Bala at the KSCA, and he's like, Wasim Jaffer, he's going to get out tomorrow early on. I said, why? This is India Pakistan in 2009, 2008, 2007 when they were touring, and end of 2007 when they were touring. And he says, it's because he's always overbalancing because his head is going over his foot, right?
Okay.
And he says his head is, like, he says, look at where his head is in line with his toe, and it's always over that. He's going to overbalance, right? Sure enough, ball 3 of the next morning, he overbalances, LBW trapped right in front of the wicket.
Right.
This is a man who obviously understood his sport so well.
Right.
Right? And to me, that just, I can't, of course there are a lot of, there are a lot of journalists who can do that, but I think by and large, they're not in it for the sport. They're in it for the Virat Kohli interview. They're in it for, the photographs and the selfie. Again, I'm not belittling their efforts, but I just think that that's a large majority of people. So
I agree.
And
yeah.
Sorry, you're saying.
So no, I agree, because you're not saying that in any way there aren't people who are true to their art still. I mean, there are lots of them.
Yeah.
But the problem I feel is that group of really talented, passionate journalists who are in it for sport has been infiltrated by a bunch of people who are not in it for the sport, and I think that number is too large for my liking.
And I mean, and think about it. There are websites now, that pay amateur writers to write for them, right? Which is great, and more power to them. But I think that it does basically that's equating someone like, and I'm not saying like, you're basically equating somebody who writes sports for a living,
Right.
with the opinion of somebody who thinks about sport every once in a while.
Sure.
Right?
And
there's a huge difference.
Yeah, and it's a huge disservice to the first
And
person.
it's a very huge disservice to the former. And I think that's important because, but again, as a to use a Hindi word, as a biradri, as a profession,
Yes.
right? It's important that the journalists sort of claim their respect back also. There's a reason why a lot of journalists, like, you go to hotel lobbies, you're waiting for a cricketer, you get treated like, you couldn't order a cup of coffee in a 5-star hotel because people are like, oh, you're a journalist, like, like, we don't want your kind here, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
And it's happened to all of us, right? And which is not fair. I mean, a lot of us have been treated unfairly, but whatever. I think we've done it to ourselves, and I think the reason is because we have created this situation where, we're chasing, like, I remember once Yuvraj Singh, told somebody I was touring with, he's like, yeah, why didn't you come to the bathroom with me as well? I'll give you another story. Right?
Jesus.
Thankfully, it was a guy, not a girl. But I just think that I just think that it's it gives you an understanding of the way that the respect has sort of eroded and sort of self-inflicted also. On the flip side, I think it's important that that you start to really study the game and then start to talk about it, because that will change the way the fans perceive the sport.
Sure.
Right? As
I see where you're going with that.
Right? So that's one very important thing of what I think, just train a better breed of journalists, a better brand of journalism, and sort of really sort of do that. And another thing is also, I think, where you start to make every create a platform for every single sporting event,
Okay.
right? Because right now, how many people knew when Hima Das was running, right, at the
Okay.
Under-20 World Championship? How many people knew that, right? We didn't know. I didn't even know where to look for it, right? Until I looked it up, and then obviously it made sense that, you know, the IAAF would have a contract with the same broadcaster that has the IOC rights,
Right.
right? So I think, but I didn't know. I mean, I didn't even calibrate that until later,
Right.
and that's important, right? Like, it's so important that we're all able to discover where, I mean, and everybody should have, like, I just, and because you asked a very blanket sort of question and sort of very blanket sort of answer,
Yeah, no, and that's fine.
like, I want to be able to follow where, you know, where Sanket is playing next, right? If he's playing in a challenge, I want to be able to see that,
Right.
right?
And if not see it, at least follow it in some way, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, whether it is,
Yeah.
if it's not live anyway, it's like, okay, can I see the live scores? Can
Correct.
I see what's going on, point to point commentary? Everybody's doing that. now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, you know, it's like, everybody is doing that. Yeah.
I mean, heck, we played in the Davis Cup. It wasn't shown anywhere,
yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's a problem. Right?
It is.
I mean, we you know, we were playing for to stay in the world in the playoff for the world group, but I just think that, you know, there are like, that's a major and of course, you know, it's a commercial argument then, right? Because, hey, we don't have enough viewers, who's going to spend money on broadcasting it, etc. But I just think that creating that access, creating that one platform where every sports fan can get access to that information,
Right.
becomes super, and as it happens in a sense almost, right?
Sure.
I don't think necessarily analysis is the way to go for a lot of the sport. Like, hey, like, why would I care? I just want to know where, I don't know. I just want to know where Jeev Milkha Singh finished. I don't want to really know. I don't know much about golf, but I think it's important for me to just keep updated with how he's done or how
The performance
Yeah.
at the end of the
Right.
day. Yeah.
But I think, to me, that you know, something on those lines would really help do a real service to the Indian sports fan. And also, I think that also gives a reference. It's a cultural reference marker, right?
Yes.
Like, we can all sort of talk about, because there's a good chance that, I mean, because I'm on BBC Sports so often, I pick up a little bit of rugby league. I pick up a little bit of, you know, what's happening in a bunch of other sports, right? Do I have a deep interest in them? I probably don't, right? But it's helping me sort of think about other sport, which in general means that, you know, there's a larger and larger mind space.
Got it.
Right? So I think that it's about sowing the seeds in a way.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that's about it. I think we had a fairly solid conversation. We managed to get a lot in. Thank you once again, Rohan. And even on a personal note, there's a big reason why Nation of Sport is here today. Personally, like to thank you. And that brings the session to the end. The council has adjourned.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad we could do this.
Thank you.